Welcome to the West Virginia Archives and History Library. This is our Thursday evening lecture. We do have some upcoming lectures on Tuesday, June 22nd. Author, journalist, and documentarian Eric Douglas will be here at 6 o'clock showing the memories of the Valley 2016. Now there's one of the things that he does is he does interviews with folks. There does little recordings that are hour long. And he has some of those left. He does them on June 20th. We're going to have one of the offices as a little recording studio. There's folks that come down and either, like, there's been World War II veterans, and various folks that have a life to tell. Some of the older folks have been down to have those recorded, but those are on the 20th of June. There's several of those blocks of time are left, and if you would like to come down and talk about something with Eric, he'd really appreciate that. On Thursday, June 29th, Ella Jean Martin will present African American Life, a personal perspective. That's another one of the block series speakers. That will start at 6 o'clock on that Thursday also. Tonight, Doug Wood will present Cultural Crossroads, establishing the 17th century fur trade in the Trans-Allegheny region. Gabriel Arthur is believed to be the first white man to see the Kanawha Valley. Doug has studied in depth the landscape and cultures that Arthur encountered on his Trans-Montane journey to the Kanawha and Ohio River valleys in 1673 and 1674 on behalf of his master, Abraham Wood. His presentation will reveal the peoples that Arthur attempted to secure to Wood's trading enterprise, as well as clues to the environment of the region at that time. Doug earned a bachelor's degree in wildlife management in 1977 from West Virginia University.
That was hard.
77, since graduation, he has melded his interest in ecology with his interest in history to enhance public understanding of the influences of historical cultures upon the natural world and vice versa. The West Virginia Humanities Council recently accepted his historical character, Gabriel Arthur, on its History Alive roster. Please welcome Doug.
Hello, y'all. Let's jump right into it. We've read the title slide for a long time now. I do have a number of quotes tonight, so you prove to you, because I am known to be kind of a stretcher of truth, to prove to you that if the truth is being stretched tonight, it's supported by other people. All right, so this is a quote from a Virginia governor and the Virginia Council writing to the Privy Council, and you can see this person, these people, are trying to convince the Privy Council that we need to spend a little more money or at least give allowance to people who want to go further west in our colony of Virginia. And then this is a quote from the authors of the book you see here, First Explorations of the Trans-Allegheny Region by the Virginians, and emphasizing, with my Bolton letters, the fur trade. And that's what we're going to be talking primarily about tonight. We won't touch much on the Asiatic commerce. Folks back in the middle 1600s thought that, can you not see me? Am I out of your range?
You're good.
Okay. They thought that the Oriental Sea was beyond the mountains, just beyond the mountains. The Indian trade is what the skin trade was called back in those days, and primarily skins were the items that the Europeans wanted to get from the American Indians. It was a special commodity for people back in the homelands of England and France and the Netherlands and other places in Europe to get these skins, these exotic skins from North America and make them into clothing, other items. So by 1645, this is kind of the lay of the land that we have here. You'll see that I at least give credit to the websites that I've stolen these pictures from. Notice how much land France has influenced. I won't say has power over, because that's not really the case. But there are a lot of Frenchmen going into the interior region of the region between Lake Superior or Lake Huron and the Lake Erie and Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence Seaway. But if we look, if I can make this work, If you can see, this area here is New England. It's controlled more or less by Great Britain. This region here, Virginia, Maryland, these two colonies, controlled more or less by Great Britain. And in between, we have New Sweden around the Delaware Bay, and we have New Netherland and New Amsterdam. You recognize New Amsterdam is in the position that New York is in today. All right, it's important to know this. We're going to move forward and understand a little bit about the characters who are involved in this play that we're talking about tonight. Virginia Governor William Berkeley obviously has an interest in opening up the West in Virginia for the fur trade. He has an economic interest in this region. And there's another fella who doesn't have an image from the period, Abraham Wood. This guy, by the middle to late 18th century, is probably the greatest dealer in furs in North America, even when you're talking about individuals involved in the fur trade. He's probably moving more furs from the west to the coast and over to England than any of the other trading enterprises in North America, including the French trading enterprises and the Netherlands, the Dutch trading enterprises out of New Amsterdam. He's just got a tremendous fur trade going on based in the region where Fort Henry was. It is Petersburg, Virginia today. You can see by the Bolton letters there that I think there are 3 points that I want you to remember. Fort Henry's location at the falls of the Appomattox River, which is a tributary to the James River, and where we call it Petersburg today. And in 1650, Wood himself was doing some of the exploring that he later sent other people like his servant Gabriel Arthur to do, trying to find other folks west of the Occaneechees to trade with. And we'll get a little more into that later. In 1663, he's commissioned a Major General, and that's the highest rank under the Royal Governor of Virginia. Now this is an image of a document, a book that was published based upon Wood's and Edward Bland's and Sackford Brewster and Elias Pennant. They were the gentlemen and the other folks who were involved in this first trip, 1650, west of Fort Henry. They mentioned in there that they had 2 servants with them, and they were guided by a fellow named Payonke, who was an Appomattox Indian. The Appomattox become very important to Wood's fur trade and other fur traders also. They're reliable. They can withstand a lot of the rigors of traveling on the frontier. They're very knowledgeable of regions west of Virginia to a point. And so they become very important to Wood and to others like William Byrd and John Lederer. So this was the journey they took, generally speaking. We can't pinpoint where they actually traveled, but we do know that they ended up at Occaneechee Town at the junction of the Roanoke River and the Dan River near the North Carolina-Virginia border. So made contact with the Occaneechees. Somebody else was already trading with the Occaneechees, but Major Wood has a good trading relationship with them after 1650 for about a decade or so. All right, this fella comes on the scene. He's a Frenchman. They crossed through years. I don't pretend to know how to pronounce that name. Is there anybody here who can pronounce that name? We'll just call him Medard. He makes a journey, notice the date, 1654. After Wood and Bland and Payonka go to Occaneechee Town, this fellow starts exploring up the Ottawa River. Now this turns out being an extremely good river to know. The passage from St. Lawrence Seaway over to Lake Nipissing, the Georgian Bay of Lake Huron, and then to other points westward, eventually in Lake Superior, down into the headwaters of Lake Erie and over Lake Michigan. And he makes this discovery of this route. Some people probably already knew the way, but he's a real promoter of the fur trade. He comes back to Montreal and he expects to be welcomed back, and people want to hear what he has to say about where he went and how come he has all these furs with him and so on and so forth. He's hoping to get investors. Instead, the authorities take his furs and they put him in jail. So that kicks him off, as you might suppose. So from this point forward, he says, well, I'm going to find somebody who's really interested in this. And lo and behold, in 1660, formerly Bonnie Prince Charlie returns to England, is crowned king, and he has a great interest in exploration and investing in the fur trade. And so, Groseilliers, Medard, the fellow that we just talked about, he becomes associated with the king and the royal family. And so, on his next journey, in 61-62, he and another fella explore the region here up to the James Bay. So they find another route of trade. This is primarily for beaver furs. And beaver furs are the priciest furs in this period. Actually, they're priciest furs all the way into the 18th century, into the middle and late 18th century. They are the ones that are desired the most. I won't get into a lot of detail about that because it'll take us all night. But those are the furs they want. And he gets an investor named Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who happens to be a royal relation to Charles II, the newly crowned King of England. So from this point forward, there's a great interest from British royals, so to speak, in the fur trade here in the north and the fur trade here in the southern colonies as well. This fella is the younger brother of Charles II. He's the Duke of York, noble Duke of York. He had 10,000 men, marched them up the hill, marched them down again. I don't think it was the same one, because the title passed on. But this guy was involved in a war, the Second Anglo-Dutch War. He plans the conquest of New Amsterdam in 1664, and in 1665, it gets carried out. And guess who else is helping him with that? Our Governor William Berkeley. He's involved in planning and carrying out the conquest of New Amsterdam. The result is not only a name change to honor the Duke, New York now instead of New Amsterdam, but another great benefit is that England, Britain, now has control of the Dutch trade, which is pretty extensive in the Great Lakes region around Erie and Ontario. And they've improved their diplomatic relationships with the Five Nations Iroquois Confederacy. And that works to the benefit of Great Britain all the way through the French and Indian War and even into the Revolutionary War. This is a quote from William C. Byrd, who is trading at the same time that Abraham Wood is trading. He has an extensive trade network as well. And he is also blessed by Governor Berkeley to carry on these activities. And Berkeley is involved with an investment in his effort as well as he is with Abraham Wood's investment. But they're competitors. And I like this list because it gives you an idea of what the folks involved in the Indian trade are expecting to take to the frontier. These are the goods that the American Indians at the time in that region desired. And we have, in case you don't know, red and blue plains, that's a type of cloth. So we have a red cloth and a blue cloth. Duffields, I don't know for sure. I think it's a type of blanketing. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody here knows better. And then Stroudwater blankets are definitely blankets. And then cutlery wares, that would be knives, brass rings, and other trinkets. Oh, did you see how far a horse could travel in a day? If there's plenty of forage, 20 miles in a day. And that's about the distance that's guesstimated from that period for people traveling 20 to 30 miles on foot in a day. It's not a leisurely pace, but it's not a long distance run either. It's not a marathon either. So here we have the route that our buddy Abraham Wood traveled. And upon that, we're going to show you where this other fella, a German national, who has been given the opportunity by Governor Berkeley to do some exploring. It's not clear whether Berkeley is invested in this or not, other than gaining the knowledge that the German is going to bring back. But this fellow named John Lederer, this German national, he's a very educated man. And when you look at his book, you can tell that by the way he writes. He records the names of different American Indian groups in the Piedmont region that he comes across, Siouan-speaking peoples primarily. And he records many of their words, and he records some of their mythology as well. So this is a pretty intelligent character, and he provides a tremendous amount of detail for folks that most historians don't know much about unless they've read his book. So this was his first journey in 1669 up the Rappahannock River. He had Chickahominy guides, and he named all three of them who guided him. This is part of his second journey. We're going to see the rest of his second journey here in a minute. He had 5 Indian guides, but he only named one, a Susquehanna named, I guess he was using the German use of the J. It's probably Youchee Pavon or something like that. And then the third journey in the same year that he took the second journey was this one. He had 5 Indian guides. He failed to name them. I like to put their names up here when we know them because they were extremely important to these expeditions. Most of our 19th century historians who recorded 18th century history and 17th century history tended to forget that the Indians had some importance to discoveries, new discoveries west of the Virginia coastal region. This is an image made by Wenceslas Haller. He was I think he was a Czech national who ended up being in England, and he became he was an artist there of some renown at the time, and this is probably a woodcut made from one of his drawings of a Virginia Indian male, probably a coastal Algonquin. It is possible that he was Siouan. We don't really know. Haller didn't mention what particular language he spoke, but because in this period the English were most familiar with the coastal Algonquins, he's probably one. So, and the Chickahominies are coastal Algonquins. The Appomattox are coastal Algonquins. So this is an image of one fella who is probably associated with one of those coastal Algonquin groups. Notice that he's wearing pearls or pearl-like shell beads. Got some, looks like claws on a special little head covering here, and he's got a funky hairdo. That's what I want next time I do a new impression. So based upon the information that we have from Lederer, he said that on basically the first leg of this trip, which I showed you already, he was accompanied by several other Virginians, and they gave up. They had a little bit of a difficulty crossing rivers, and they gave up. It turns out one of them went back and started spreading rumors that Lederer was maybe dead, and that he was causing trouble, and really gave him a bad reputation for a while until he got back to defend himself. So this Susquehannock stayed with him, and they continued to travel the Piedmont region into North Carolina around the vicinity of Winston-Salem. We know this because we have a pretty good idea that that's where Sorrowtown was, and you can see on this map that that's Sorrowtown there. Now this map is a map made by Alvord and Midgood, the authors. But nonetheless, there is a place there today called Sorrowtown Mountains. If you go talk to anybody who lives in that region, they can tell you exactly where Sorrowtown Mountains are. And so we have a pretty good idea that's where the Sorrows were living at the time. And then they return. Now they come across a number of different peoples in different towns. And this is a Susquehanna Warrior from 1612. This guy was sort of like a Goliath. He was a really tall Indian, and John Smith, being a very short man, Captain John Smith, he thought that it was a pretty good idea to record what this guy looked like. He had had 3 bear heads sewn together into a cape. His arm's coming out of one bear head, this arm's coming out of another, and there's a bear head hanging here. And dangling from the nose of each bear head is a bear paw. And then he had a wolf's head dangling from a necklace, and he had a wolf quiver, a wolf skin quiver made also. And he was very tall. The Susquehannocks are a giant-like people, and thus attired. So they're giants like this guy, and they're dressed like this guy. That's what he was saying, basically. We don't know if Lederer's guide looked like that. Probably not. This fellow here was dressed in warrior mode, and John Lederer's guide would not have been in warrior mode. But this was the result of Lederer's journeys. 1670, had a book published, and guess what? Abraham Wood could read. William Byrd could read. They probably took advantage of what Lederer wrote in there. He had a map in there. But Diane and I were lucky enough to be in Williamsburg one year when at the DeWitt Wallace Museum, they had one of the originals. And I say one of the originals because they didn't have Xerox or fax machines or anything like that, copiers back then. So Lederer made, I think he made 2 maps. And they had one there on display for a while at Williamsburg. And that's what, while there's a bright light there, it's because that's our camera flashing, right, Diane?
Yeah, that one needs Photoshop.
But it is interesting. It gives several of the rivers that we're familiar with today, some of them with a different name. This is the Roanoke River, also known as the Stanton River, and in this case, also called the Shawana River, or Shawana Flu, as he liked to call them. But he traveled on his second journey right here to Mohawk, and that's where everybody left him except Youchee, Bayton, or whatever the fellow's name was, the Susquehanna. They went to Nahissan Town, probably related to the Catawbas, who call themselves Yesau, Saponi Town, Akamichi Town, a couple other towns I can't quite make out, Wateree, Sara Town, and that's a place that becomes important in later travels to the region, Weesaki, and then they travel back, go past the Tuscaroras, right here, and then back to Fort Henry. His comment about what you should carry to trade is not only about what you carry to trade to the near Indians, but what you should carry to trade with the remoter Indians, those that are further away. Because guess what? Nobody had been to those remoter Indians until Lederer. Well, there were probably some people traveling there, but nobody quite as educated as Lederer. So he gives pointers to people. This is what you should take to the remoter Indians. Lots of what we might call trinkets. Things, shiny things, beautiful things. Because they find those things something attractive. They want to adorn themselves with it. Maybe some of those items look like they're beads, and their beads are coins. Beads are money. Here we have the quote that tells us that. Current coin of small shells, which they call Roanoke or Piak, peak. I'm going to show you. This is from a Virginia history website, National Park Service. These shell ornaments are called moons today. I don't know what they were called back then. These are piaks or peaks. These are Roanokes or Roanokes. These are drilled. They're hollow. These are drilled. We call them today hair pipes, but they're not hair pipe. They're either bone or they're central stalk of a lightning well, or they're a shell called a dentalia, which is a tubular shaped shell. But these guys are hard to make. It takes a lot of work to take a piece of a mussel shell and make it round, piece of flat mussel shell, make it flat, make it round or circular, and drill a hole in it. These are a little difficult as well, but it takes less work because you don't have to make them so small. So what city is named after a shell bead? Roanoke, Virginia. Why is that? Because Roanoke Island was a center of manufacture in the 16th century for these beads. Roanoke Island, which is at the mouth of Roanoke River. And so they got the name Roanokes. These are some examples from West Virginia State Park, Pipestem State Park, from a grave robber or amateur archaeologist. It depends on who you talk to, named Haskell Shoemake, his collection. They have a lot of items that Haskell Shoemake used to own. And these beads were found in West Virginia, particularly around the New River area. These are Olivella shells from either the Gulf Coast or the Southern Atlantic Coast. These are probably central stalk of lightning whelk made into runtees, which is kind of a short, fat Roanoke. These are more like Roanokes here, and these are really like Roanokes right here. And these are bear's teeth up here. This is from a whelk shell. Again, none of this was collected from West Virginia originally. I mean, these made items were, but the original sources of these shells from either the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic Coast, in an extensive trade network that included our region right around here. Now, this is a little aside. Look at the prices here. We have one place, 1638, one time when we can compare, this is in Maryland, we can compare the price of Piak and Roanoke. Now, a piak, this piak is measured per fathom. What's a fathom? This is a fathom.
6 feet.
Yeah, about 6 feet. But if you're measuring in the field and you don't have a ruler, this is a fathom. And an arm's length, so a fathom consists of about 3 arms lengths, a little bit shorter than 3 arms lengths, because your chest from here to here is shorter than your arms, but not much shorter than your arms. So I multiplied by 3 that measurement, and I come up with about equal amounts of piak, 90 pennies, 90 cents, Roanoke, 36 cents. Why is piak more expensive? It's harder to make those little things, that's why. Yeah, a lot of drilling, but look how tiny they are. These don't just pop out of the shells like this, folks. They have to be made. And it takes a whole lot of work. Plus, when you have them strung, you have a whole lot more piaks on the string than you have the Roanokes. So that's just a little interesting aside to show you we can dig, if we mine enough in old documents, you can find ways to compare prices of one item to another. This is Julie. I don't know her last name. She's an interpreter at Pipesing State Park. And she's got about 2.5 fathoms of piak from the Haskell Shoemake collection there, strung up. And then these are Marginella shells here. These are also from the southern Atlantic or the Gulf Coast. And these are central stalks of whelks for sure. You can see the twist there, the central stalk of the whelk. Now, let's focus a little more. We're moving ahead in time. We're getting into the late 17th century. Abraham Wood is, at this point in time, Abraham Wood is trying to figure out how do I avoid the Occaneechees? Because now the Occaneechees have placed themselves, they're in the middle of the trading path. They're attempting to control the goods flowing from the people further west to Abraham Wood's trade and William Byrd's trade, and they're attempting to control Byrd's people and Wood's people going westward. So he's trying to figure out how do I get around them. So he sends this fellow named Gabriel Arthur and a gentleman named James Needham. The blue one, of course, you may recall his letters. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. He sends Batts and Fallon first in 71. Thomas Batts, Robert Fallon. But he is trying to figure out a way around the Occaneechees at this point in time. And so he avoids them entirely. Occaneeche town is, at this point in time, 1671, it's up here in this region. But by the next year or so, they move down to this region, which is a more frequently used trading path by the Western Indians in North Carolina and Western Virginia. They come and usually go this way to Fort Henry. So Batts and Fallon were instructed to avoid the Occaneechees altogether, which they do. And Alvord and Bidgood, the authors of the book where Abraham Wood's documents are recorded, they believe that these two fellows and their guide, Paracute, who was an Appomattox Indian, make it to about Narrows, Virginia. And they don't go much further than that. Other historians have thought that they came down the Kanawha River and maybe got to the Kanawha Falls, area up around Golly Bridge. But more recently, an historian named Alan Bryson has come up with this scenario. He believes they traveled through Mercer County, McDowell County, into perhaps Logan and Mingo County, and came across an old village on Sandy River, or on the Tug Fork of Sandy River, around Mayborn, perhaps. Bob Maslowski, who I was hoping was going to be here tonight, he's a retired archaeologist from the Army Corps of Engineers, which means he still does archaeological work, but the Army Corps of Engineers doesn't pay him much anymore. But anyway, Bob thinks they may have been on the Guyandotte River in the vicinity of Logan. And it's up in the air, no one is 100% sure, but Alan Bryson was the first historian to take seriously the mileages that Batts and Fallon gave in their journal. And he thinks, based upon distances between two known points, a couple of times in their journal, they were pretty much right on. So based upon those two comparisons of two known points, and the mileages that they gave, and the mileages we know today, he thinks that they were fairly accurate. The previous Batson or Albert and Bidgood thought they were way off, thought they were way overestimating their distances, which is why they think they ended up at Narrows and no further. But by Bryson's calculation, they went much further. And I think, my personal opinion is he's probably correct. There's some archaeology that feeds into this, that lends itself to this belief, and we'll get into that here in a little bit. So this is about the furthest they went, and these are their journal entries for the September 16th and 17th. And I want to clarify that anytime you have an old document that's written by hand and you're trying to transcribe it, it's not an easy thing to do, especially if they were using a cursive style of writing. They may or may not have. I've never seen the original documents, but we do know that the Mohicans weren't anywhere near this region. So the suspicion is this is a transcription error of the word Monitan or something like it. Further on, it was spelled M-O-K-E-T-A-N. Again, it's the same people, two different spellings, 2 days apart, probably a transcription error, probably. And so now we think they were Monitan Indians. Here's another one, Mohita, again. So probably Monitans. An N and an H look very close to one another, very similar to one another. But this is an interesting quote. They mentioned the Toteras in this quote. The Toteras were known, but not before John Lederer heard about them and wrote about these people that supposedly existed in this region. Batson Fallon came across them, came across their town. And the interesting part of the description is the salt that was being made and the great company of Indians that lived upon the great water. Now, Wood took this to mean the Oriental Sea. But that's not what Fallon said. He just said the great water. So we're going to see another quote later on and then come back to this one to get a better idea. After Batson and Fallon were back, Wood is pretty excited about these new people that are perhaps living out there in the west beyond the mountains, the Monitans. So he gets another expedition together. And this is when his man, his probably indentured servant, Gabriel Arthur, and the gentleman, Mr. Needham from South Carolina, agreed to go. Gabriel Arthur is probably a relatively young man. He might be dressed like I am, but he won't be as old and wrinkly as I am. Although he could be. He spent a lot of time in the sun, I'm sure. But, Needham is probably more elderly than Gabriel Arthur is. And they have with them some Appomattox guides, and they go on this, what's going to be a 3-month trip. They have provisioned themselves for 3 months. Turns out not to be that short. So here's a quote that mentions a new people. Now, new to us because we haven't seen them yet, I haven't exposed you to them yet. And nobody's sure where they're living at this point in time. But they call themselves Tamahitans. And interesting, Needham and Arthur get through Occoneechee town, but not without some trouble. The Occoneechees are definitely dead set on stopping this trading enterprise from going around them. And there's a lot of hostility towards Needham and Arthur because they're associated with Abraham Wood at this point in time. They get through, they get by, and on their way past, westward, southwestward, they come across these Tamahitans who are traveling to the Occoneechis. Why? Because they're going to trade to the Occoneechis, their furs, and then the Occoneechis are going to up the price and trade to Wood. And this is why Wood is trying to avoid these folks. They're middlemen. And he's trying to make a higher profit for his investors who are investing in his enterprise, and so he wants to cut out the middlemen. Now, we see the route of Batson Fallon, we see the route of Lederer there to Saratown, and now see where these guys go. Remember what I told you? By this time, the Occoneechis had moved down from here, about the Danville area. They had moved down closer to the junction of the Dan River and the Roanoke, or Stanton River as it's called sometimes in that period. So they're here trying to control this trade now. Needham and Arthur go through there, they get to Sautertown, they go to a place called Sitteree, which is pretty close to the edge of the Blue Ridge, and they hop over the Blue Ridge here with the Tamahitans. They are following the Tamahitans into terra incognita for English-speaking peoples. And you saw on the map where the French had gone. None of the French had been in the Ohio Valley at this point in time. So to the French probably have an idea, since they've been down the Mississippi, that the Oriental Sea is not there. But the English are still operating on the hope that they are going to go across those mountains and find a junction with the Oriental Sea. Thus have a short trading route to the riches of the Orient. Needham and Arthur spent some time at Tamahita town. Eventually, Needham goes back across the mountains to take messages to Abraham Wood, back to the fellow who's paying for this expedition. He and Paracute leave and go back. Arthur happens to get caught up in a terrible situation in Tamahita town. There are friends of the Occaneechees there. Basically, the Tamahita are kind of split between different factions. And the friends of the Occaneechees they decide to grab Arthur and put him to death. They have him tied to a stake. They put canes around him, get him ready to light the canes, and the king, or the chief of the Tamahitans, arrives back from a hunting trip with a gun, Spanish Nicolette you and I were talking about earlier, shoots the fellow who's about to put fire to Gabriel Arthur, and says, "We'll have none of this." Takes Gabriel Arthur, basically makes him a part of his family, sees the advantage to having this fellow who has trade goods treated well in their town. Now I'm going to show you the journeys that Gabriel Arthur took with the king of the Tamahita. Eventually, over the course of about a year and a half, he travels to a Spanish fort near the Apalachicola River, near the Gulf of Mexico, and back. He travels to near Savannah, a place called Port Royal, South Carolina, around Christmas time, and back. The rest of the winter, he travels into the Kanawha Valley and goes over into the Ohio Valley and back. And he makes one more trip. This one is a little less known. He goes down the Tamahita River. We don't exactly know where they were. Albert and Bidgood thinks they were in West Tennessee. So does John Swanson, who studied the Youchees, and we'll get to that here in a minute. Alan Bryson thinks they maybe were in Georgia or Alabama. But be that as it may, they were in a region that allowed them to spoke out on a number of rivers and have pretty easy canoe travel downstream, and for the most part, not too difficult canoe travel upstream. So he traveled close to 3,000 miles once he returned to Virginia after all this. This was for a 3-month journey. Ended up not being 3 months. Up to recent times, most historians thought that the Tamahitans were Cherokee. They weren't paying attention to what an ethnologist, John Swanson, said. He actually traced the Tamahitans, their names, where their villages were, based upon old documents from the 17th and 18th century. Those are some of the names you can see there for the Tamahitans, the way they're written. And then this is his conclusion. The origin of Tamahita, like those of the Youchee, may be traced far north to the Tennessee mountains. He was equating the Youchee with the Tamahitans. He thinks that the Tamahitans were Youchees, and he is probably right. They probably were not Cherokee, they were probably Youchees. This is an image of a Youchee from much later, 1736. Two living in Georgia, the queen and king of Youchee. It was a town there that they lived in. He's wearing a buffalo robe. We don't know if they looked this way nearly 100 years before or not, but that's the earliest image that I know of that we have, were the drawings of George Friedrich von Wreck, 1736, drawings and paintings. Now this is an interesting note by Frank Speck, an ethnologist in the early 20th century. He's talking about living Youchees out west. They moved out west, living Youchees, and how they make these little clay figurines. He says that they're clumsy. In other words, they're not taking a whole lot of time to make them. And he wasn't really sure why they were making them. And they were not baked. Well, there's an interesting potential connection here with West Virginia. At the sites that are designated the Clover people, and Darla might be able to speak to this, I don't know, but Bob Maslowski thinks that there might possibly be a connection, not necessarily that these people in West Virginia were Youchees, but there may be some cultural connection, because these little, not very well made clay figurines, people's heads and animals, were found at a number of Clover sites in West Virginia. And the Clover sites that he has on his map here, Buffalo's downstream from Winfield, the Rolfley site over on the Ohio River downstream from Point Pleasant, and then the Clover site at Green Bottom, where the wildlife management area is today. Those are the three sites that he's calling the Clover people. And as I think Darla will attest, if you have three archaeologists in a room, you have three different opinions about who's what. Is that basically true? Pretty much. So I don't know how many people agree with Bob that these three might be culturally related to some degree, but he's based it upon the material culture found in those sites. And he made the point to me one time that he thought there might be a Youchee connection. And then once I found that quote by Speck, I thought, oh, well, that's probably why. The Youchees, some of the prehistoric Youchee material had these little clay figurines. The modern Youchees in 1909 were making those clay figurines. And there are these little clay figurines, which are not that common in other excavations in West Virginia, found at these sites, which Bob thinks might be one culture, possibly one culture. And then just to give you another little note about the Youchees, this is a map that was made by a Catawba Indian. In here is the name of the Catawba, Nassau, like I said, Nahissan and Yeesaw, those are all names for Catawba and Catawba-related peoples. This map is from Charleston, South Carolina, through Catawba country to Virginia. This is Virginia here. And this author of the map, the person who made the map, Catawba Indian, was not trying to show exactly where these are located. These are the Cherokees here, the Chickasaws here. He was basically trying to say, these are our relations, these are our connections. So if you want to go to Virginia, or almost any other people west of us, you need to go through our nation. That's what this map is really saying. We are an important cog in your wheel of trade. He was telling Charleston authorities this with this map. And right there in the middle, there's a little blob of Youchees right there. They're called Youchee on this map, but those are Youchees. So the Youchees are scattering after Arthur comes across them. They start scattering afterwards, and there's a reason for that, and we'll see why here in a minute. This is where Swanson and Albert and Big Good think that the Youchee town was. Some here were here in the west or the East Tennessee mountains, near the Hiawassee River, perhaps. There was a site found there that's been identified as Youchee, an archaeological site. And this is where Alan Bryson thinks they may have been centered. The problem with that is, if Gabriel Arthur was correct about it being 10 days' journey from the Youchee town or the Tamahita town into the Kanawha Valley to the Monitans, then this almost doubles that distance. And so it would have to be 20 days, 25 days journey. Here's a quote. This is what Arthur told Wood, and Wood wrote it down, that the king of the Tamaitans must go and visit his friends. Or the king of the Tamaitans must go visit the Monitans, his friends. Okay, that's the first, we have the first clear record that might allow us to trace what language group do the Monitans belong to. Because Arthur told Wood, broke down the word. Moni signifies water, and ton, great, or large, or big, as we would say today. And then this is my little paraphrase down here to help you understand a little bit better down here. So the name of the town is Big Water, or Gray Water. We know it's not Water Great. I'll show you why here in a minute. A fellow named Horatio Hale came across the last living, full-blood, as he called it, Tutelo Indian in Canada on the Grand River Reservation of the Iroquois. And when was he there? 1870. This fellow was 106 by his best recollection in 1870. He happens to be wearing a coat that was given him when he worked for the British. He was a soldier for the British in the War of 1812. So Hale interviewed him through an interpreter. This fellow could speak Cayuga and Tutelo. And he interviewed him and recorded a lot of words. And Hale, without knowing the story of Gabriel Arthur, recorded these words. Itani, or Itan, that's nasal, Itan, Itani, and Mani, grape and water. Isn't that something? Now we know the Monitans were speaking a Tutelo-like language, and the Tutelo were Eastern Siouan speakers. Now we know. So, with that in mind, now we go back to the Toteras. Remember the Toteras? Guess what? Tutelo is an anglicization of the Iroquois word for these people, Toderichrone, Totero. So when you see Tutelo, it's the people that have settled Totera town. Archaeologists think that it could be in Salem, Virginia, or Radford, Virginia, and it might have moved from Salem to Radford. But that's where they think the town was. And the Monitans obviously were closely related linguistically to them because they spoke a similar language. Guess what? Go to the Big Sandy River about the time that Lewis Evans was making his map based upon testimonies of people who had traveled there, like Christopher Gist, Thomas Walker, and others who had traveled west in the 1700s. And Evans says that one of the names for the Big Sandy Creek, or Big Sandy River as we call it today, was Toteroy. Toteroy or Big Sandy Creek. And Little Sandy is called Little Toteroy. There was obviously an Eastern Siouan presence in the Ohio Valley that lent its name to those two streams. It doesn't mean that they lived at the mouth. They might have lived further up, like at the forks of the Leviza and the Tug Fork, where they come together at Fort Gay. There's been some archaeological information from there. Now we come to our friend Arles Spencer. If you were lucky enough to hear her talk a while back, she gave a lot of details that I'm not going to go into. But I wanted to use one of her maps, and she actually gave me permission to do this, because she's a nice lady. Dawn's a professional archaeologist. She did a really interesting study of pottery found in our region, the Kanawha Valley, Ohio Valley region. Did you actually get to view some of the pottery in Virginia as well when you were doing that study?
I did visit once.
You did visit?
Keith Egloff.
Yeah, Keith Egloff, which you quoted somewhat in this the article here. By the way, West Virginia archaeologists, you can find them all here at the library, and several of these books that I've been showing you quotes from are here. The one that's missing, the really important one that's missing, but Randy's going to make a point to get it, or somebody's going to make a point to get it, is the one that Wood's record of Arthur's testimony about his journals, his travels are in. But with the light-colored circles, you see there's a region in southwest Virginia that was dominated by these Siouan cultures. And we know from letters, writings, that those people in the Piedmont region and draping, we also learned from the archaeology that they obviously draped over into the Holston River, the Tennessee River watershed as well, people who were making similar pottery. Now this is prehistoric and protohistoric. So this was long before, or not long before, right before Arthur comes into the region. But also some sites in West Virginia had pottery that was comparably made to the people that we know were Siouan. Now this is still a working hypothesis, right, Darla? This is not absolute that the people who were making these pots spoke a Siouan language, but the lines of evidence are starting to converge, and we're starting to see some history and some archaeology coming together. Yes?
Keith Egloff from Virginia said that the only sites he's seen this type of pottery on is Siouan.
Keith Egloff, archaeologist in Virginia that Darla has collaborated with, in case you couldn't hear her, he says the types of pottery we're talking about are only found at sites that were known to be Eastern Siouan. Right? This is Batson Fallon's route, based upon Bryson's study of their journal. And this is, generally speaking, Arthur's route from West Tennessee, if that's indeed the way he came. We don't know exactly how he got into the Kanawha Valley. We're certain now he was in the Kanawha Valley. Kentucky claimed him for a long time, and he probably did end up in Kentucky before he headed south back to the Tamatans. But when he came to the Monitans, he was very likely in the Kanawha Valley. Maybe visiting one of the sites that have been excavated, or maybe visiting a site that has never been excavated, like under the World War I plant at Nitro before any excavation could be done, or some other broad plain in the area where they tended to construct their towns. Now, the previous quote I want you to try to think about the Great Water. Look at this quote. This is from Arthur's trip. He's basically telling his friend John Richards and his investor John Richards that the place where Arthur visited the Monitans is the same river that Batson and Fallon were on the heads of in the previous trip. And he talks about out of the westerly side of that river goes another very great river. What would that be? If you follow the river, Kanawha River, northwest, what flows out of its westerly side? That's the Ohio. And it's another great river, about a day's journey lower. Well, Buffalo's about a day's walk, according to 17th century and 18th century standards of walking. It's about a day's walk to Point Pleasant from the Buffalo area. So at that point, it seems that he's talking about the Ohio River, and there's a huge number of people living on that river, according to what he said there. An innumerable company of Indians on that great river. Let's go back to that other quote. A great company of Indians that lived upon the great water. Wood probably misinterpreted that to be the Oriental Sea, when in fact it was probably the Ohio River, as Arthur described it to Wood later on. All right, now we've got Gabriel Arthur's journey. He opened up the possibility of trade with 3 Western Indian nations or groups that Wood had never had trade with before, except through the Occaneechees, and the Tamatans were bringing their furs there to the Occaneechees. From about 1620 to about 1690, the 6 Nations Confederacy, originally the 5 Nations Confederacy, after 1722 they become the 6 Nations, so we should call them the 5 Nations in this particular presentation. They have, with those little red arrows you see, they have conquered more or less the entire region of the Ohio Valley down to part of central Kentucky there. They spread their empire to try to control the fur trade. That's one of the reasons. Try to control the fur trade. And guess what? Who's in their way? The Monitans and somebody else here in the Ohio Valley that Gabriel Arthur went to fight. We're going to see that. So these war parties traveled through West Virginia over and over again in the 1600s for about 70 or 7 decades. Traveling through, this is an image from 1666 of an Iroquois war party returning with a captive. This would have been a typical sight to see in this region over those decades. The Monitans are right there in the middle of this war. When Gabriel Arthur left with the Tamatans, the Moniton town, they left the Moniton town, they went west, they went northwest down the river, and they went to that great water that flows out of the westerly side of the river that the Monitans lived on, and they gave a clap to some of the enemy of the Tamatans. Who were those people? We now know who the Monitans are. We know who the Tamatans are. At least we know their language affiliation. Tamatans are Youchee. The Monitans are Siouan speakers. Who are the Tamatans warring with in the Ohio Valley? 3 days from the Moniton town. Well, I won't say I know for sure, but in 1673, French authors mention the Mosopelay, who are living on the Ohio River, near the headwaters of the Ohio River. Look at this map, which was later, 1684. Right here we see Mosopelay Sipi. That's an Algonquin type of ending for stream or river. But it could be an Algonquin ending based upon an Algonquin language who we're talking about the Mosopelea. The Mosopelea may not be an Algonquin language. It may be another language. We don't really know for sure. But it's the same river. Ohio, or in French, Mosopelea Sipi, or Oligin. This is definitely an Algonquin language family word. We get the word Allegheny from it for the Ohio and the upper river of the Ohio, the Allegheny River. So, who are the Mosopelea? Well, as you can see, the quote right up there says in French, Mosopelea, 8 villages destroyed. By 1684, these people who are living in 1673 on the upper Ohio are destroyed. They're run out. And I just showed you why they were run out. Because the Iroquois are advancing into the region and taking prisoners, fighting people. People are leaving out of there. We still don't know who the Mosopelea are. The linguists are arguing about that right now. There are some people who think they were Siouan speakers. Some people think they were Algonquin speakers. And some people think they were Iroquois speakers. So we don't really know. But I think, personally, that whoever they were, those are the people that were fighting with the Tremontans, the Youchees, who lived 3 days' journey from the Montane town. Well, Arthur has a good experience with these folks. Similar to what happened to him in Tremonti, first thing that happens when he gets captured, I think I've got a quote here, he gets captured, he's taken down to the river, he's scrubbed, and lo and behold, when they got the paint off, because he was painted like the warriors of the Tremontans were painted, he's a white guy. And they make a big deal of that. Why does Wood say they make a big deal of that? He's trying to make Richards understand they hadn't seen a white guy before. And, you know what about the knife and the hatchet? Where is it? Sorry about that. Arthur told Wood that he saw no manner of iron instrument amongst them. They didn't have a knife, a hatchet, a pot, nothing made out of iron. This was new turf. This is the thing that's going to get John Richards back in England excited. He's going to tell potential investors, hey, new people, why? Because the prices of their skins are going to be low. Let's check this out. What you have above is a comparison a little bit later, 1703, the price of beaver skins in purchasing knives. The price of knives and beaver skins is what it is. And 6 knives, 1 beaver skin in season. That means in the wintertime, a large beaver taken in the wintertime. The beaver skin is 6 times the value of a knife. The axis, the beaver skin, is 2 times the value of an axe. Let's go to Gabriel's time. It's 30 years before, and yes, there's inflation and so on and so forth. But in Gabriel's time, he's saying 4 beaver skins for 1 knife. So a beaver skin is only 1/4 the value of a knife. And a hatchet is only 1/8 the value of a knife. Why? Because he can get that price from them. You know what the Occaneechees are paying? The Occaneechees are paying for 2 knives, they're giving him 4 beaver skins. See? So he's getting a better deal with these people who don't have any iron whatsoever, and they have lots of beavers. What was the landscape like when he was here in the Kanawha Valley and in the Ohio Valley? What was it like? Was it entirely forested, like some quotes we saw when we were in grade school and later about squirrels climbing up a tree on the Chesapeake Bay and not touching ground until they got to the Ohio or the Mississippi? Not really. Yeah, there was some extensive forest around where people didn't travel or people hadn't resided for a while. But quite frankly, in the valley here, it was a mix of vegetated landscape. We had savannas, we had canebrakes, we had all kinds of openings. Arthur mentioned slashes. Those are places where there's no trees growing in a forested region at all. We had numerous wetlands and salt springs here in the valley. The salt springs provided the impetus for the later salt industry in the early 1800s. Abundance of freshwater food sources in the Kanawha River and its larger tributaries. And abundance of upland animal food sources. Trading roads spoke in many directions. You saw some of the trade goods, the shells that have been found in West Virginia all over. in West Virginia, those shells have been found. Some other interesting items too, which I'll show you here in a minute. Some of the animals that were found then and are not found now, the eastern elk. Now, of course, our DNR is bringing back some western elk, but this is the only painting known from life of an eastern elk made by John James Audubon. He purchased these elk from somebody who had captured them in western New York, in Iroquois country, as a matter of fact. Captured them when they were young, raised them, I guess, wanted to get rid of them. You know, it's like buying a tiger when it's a cub. I mean, what do you do when it gets older? You know, sell it to somebody who wants it, you know. So anyway, he kept these elk on his home. He had a home in Manhattan, on Manhattan Island. He kept them there and he painted them from life. Eastern cougars, some people say they're still here wandering around. Well, the biologists say they're not. Genetically, you can prove that the eastern cougars are not here. But western cougars have certainly made their way here, one way or the other. But they used to be fairly abundant in our region. Top predators, of course. The eastern wolf, we now know the eastern wolf was in here in West Virginia. This is another version of the eastern wolf, formerly Canis rufus. Now most geneticists are saying it's probably the same as the eastern wolf in Algonquin Provincial Park. Somewhat different from the gray wolf. But that's the animal that used to be really common in West Virginia. We have a lot of streams in West Virginia named Wolf Creek, Wolf Run, etc., etc. Passenger pigeon, now extinct, used to be here upon occasion in great numbers, darkened the sky for hours at a time as they were migrating through from one place to another. Passenger pigeon place names, a little hard to see, but little pink spots there. Those are streams, primarily streams, and some knobs that are named after pigeons in West Virginia. The yellow star is where Charleston is, or the heart of the Montane country, so to speak. And this is an interesting find, and I give a nod to my birding friends here in the crowd, Jim. This is a quote from Daniel McKinley, who was wrote about the Carolina parakeet in Virginia. It's reviewing historical literature and archaeological finds. And I thank Darla for putting me onto this particular source, as a matter of fact. A parakeet humerus was found at the Buffalo site, as was the skull of an ivory-billed woodpecker. Well, does that mean that they lived here? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. We'll see why. Here's a Carolina parakeet, what they used to look like. They're all gone now. Look at this quote from 1662. Parakeet feathers were involved in the trade, the skin trade between American Indians from the south and the north. The southern Indians, where the parakeets lived, traded green parakeet feathers to the northern Indians. In 1662, that's just a little before our buddy Gabriel Arthur comes into this region. So it is possible that that humerus found at Buffalo was, the humerus is this part of the wing, was on a whole wing, carried north, traded to the Montanas, or whoever else was living here at the time. And maybe they were going to trade even further north. It's hard to say. And here's a comparison of pileated woodpecker and ivory-billed woodpecker bill. Look at that quote, a little bit later, 1731. Isn't that interesting? So that may be why there was an ivory-billed woodpecker head at Buffalo, found at Buffalo. There may have been a trade, even in the 1600s, in ivory-billed woodpecker bills, beaks. And there are actually some museum specimens today of American Indian, I believe in the 18th century, of items made from ivory-billed woodpecker heads. With the feathers on, by the way, with the feathers on the head. Well, so what became of this fur trade enterprise that Abraham Wood was about to make good on, about to really cash in? Gabriel Arthur, oh, by the way, Needham was murdered. Did I mention that? Poor Needham. Went back, took his messages to Wood, came back to meet up with Arthur, and he was murdered by Occaneechi. An Occaneechi Indian named John Hassakal, or Indian John. He murdered him. Arthur didn't know it at the time, of course. He found out once he got back to Abraham Wood's place at Fort Henry. What happened was, even though Arthur had found 3 nations of Indians that Abraham Wood had never traded with before, and he could get a really good price for beaver skins out of at least one of those nations, it never came to fruition. because in 1676, Bacon's Rebellion happened. This is the place where Nathaniel Bacon lived. Diane and I were there last year, touring a region there, and saw a little sign for Bacon's Castle, and went out there, and lo and behold, that's Nathaniel's mansion. Anyway, he was a planter who didn't like Governor Berkeley's policies on Indian trade. And he was kind of jealous of Governor Berkeley's ability to wrest all this money from the Indians. Nathaniel was interested in selling tobacco and other crops that he was growing. He wasn't interested in Indian trade. He didn't like the Indians. Maybe kind of racist, it's hard to say. He considered any action of an Indian to be a depredation upon his plantation. And probably there were a few. So he led a revolt against Governor Berkeley, and Abraham Wood, consequently, who was sent out to put the rebellion down, to try to keep Governor Berkeley from being so soft on the Indians who committed depredations upon the planters. And that basically ended this potential enterprise that was about to happen for Abraham Wood. He was getting older, and eventually the rebellion was quelled, but it took a lot out of Wood's enterprise. He never fulfilled his hopes of trading with the Western Indians after that. But from the Western Indian perspective, the Mosopalaeans, or whomever they were, had a taste of English steel. Because Gabriel Arthur left his hatchet and his knife with the Mosopalaean king. And he told them that, hey, we can have a trade. And they were pretty eager. That undoubtedly played into the later fur trade. Let's see what happens. You can see here Batson Fallon's journey, Arthur's journey into the Kanawha Valley and back to Western Tennessee or Georgia or wherever they happen to be. And then, a little bit after that, after the Iroquois Wars are dying down, 1692, 94, through 94, a man named Arnott comes out of Port Orange, we call it Albany today. Now remember, the British now have control of the Dutch trade. And guess what? These Dutch traders are working for Britishers now. They've got British investors in their exchanges now. This guy goes way to the west, picks up some Shawnees. He has some Delaware guys with him. He picks up some Shawnees. They come back. These are the first Shawnees coming into eastern Pennsylvania and southern New York. They're not here yet. There are some in the south here, but they're not that far north yet. And then a man named Martin Chartier, married to a Shawnee woman, brings a band of Shawnees, or he follows a band of Shawnees, more like it, out of one of the forts, the French forts. He's basically a deserter. He leaves out. He comes to the east. He settles at Old Town, Maryland. A guy named Wapetha, who is the leader of that band, or we know him today as Opessa. Opessa's town was in that area there. So those are the first Shawnees in Maryland, coming into Maryland. So what's the deal? What's that got to do with the fur trade? Well, what's happened, since there's peace now, the Iroquois are no longer expanding their empire, there is this opportunity to exchange. But what Veely and others see as an opportunity now is you don't necessarily have to go all the way out here to trade with these people, the Shawnees and whoever else is in here. You entice them to come back and hunt the woods around there and the wetlands around there for beavers. And that's what they did. They brought their own hunters back with them to provide them with the game that they wanted to make skins out of. Just two places where Gabriel Arthur came across three different nations in three places: the Tamaitans, the Monitans, and possibly the Mosopalaeans in the Ohio Valley. 1701, there's a big peace. It's instigated by the French and some of the Algonquin and Iroquois-speaking peoples who've been fighting for a long time. And there's this grand peace treaty made. These are some of the Indian signatures. That means, guess what? Trade can open up again. And what happens if you've had an incessant war, decade after decade after decade? What happened to the Ohio Valley and the Kanawha Valley after all the people left for a couple of decades? What do deer do if you leave them alone? They make more deer, don't they? Beavers do the same. Raccoons. Anything you might desire. If you leave them alone, don't hunt them, they will expand their population. Even if they have predators around them, as long as they don't have the human predators, they'll expand the population. So into this void of our region come, these are new people. Now they may be connected genetically and linguistically to some of the people who were here before, but their culture is vastly different. They've had goods, they've had trade goods for a while now. They know how to deal with the Europeans who are moving into the area. So it's a different culture now. They depend now upon European goods for many aspects of their culture. The Wyandotte, Delaware, Shawnee, Mingo move into the region, and the trade starts up again in earnest. Coming in their canoes, they're walking into the region. Their typical seasonal round, they enter the woods in the fall to hunt for deer skins, and then later in the winter they switch to the fur bears, the beaver, and the otter. They build their little wigwams. The Delawares in particular have numerous hunting camps scattered around northern West Virginia. The Shawnee have their hunting camps scattered to the central part of the state and the southern part of the state. And the Cherokees come into the southern part of the state as well to hunt for skins, to hunt for animals, to provide skins to the trading partners in the early 18th century. A lot of deer here now, easy to get lots of skins. From about 1720 to 1750, I'm going to give you some examples of the camps and communities that are established by American Indians in our region in that period. Anthony's Creek, over in Greenbrier County, according to Thomas Walker, was named after an Indian named Anthony. And he noted that in 1750 when he traveled through the area. So it was probably a Delaware Indian. Anthony is a common surname now amongst the Delaware, probably a Delaware Indian. Buckland-Gahannon, another Delaware living in the Buchanan region. White Day, Opekishku. Anybody ever been to Opekiska Locks on the Monongahela River, or West? I think it's over the Monongahela. That's named after Wapakishku, who was a guy named White Day, a Delaware named White Day, who had a hunting camp on White Days Creek, at the mouth of White Days Creek, where it runs into the Monongahela River. Wapetha, I mentioned already. He was a Shawnee. Catfish's Camp, another Delaware. That's Little Washington, Pennsylvania. Chartiers. Well, Martin Chartier and his Shawnee wife had a son. They named him Peter, or Pierre Chartier, and he came back across the Alleghenies and settled a number of different places, villages and camps along the Monongahela and Ohio rivers. Logstown was primarily a Delaware town, some Shawnees there as well, a few Mingos. Mingo Town, I wonder who lived there. Wawindahualand, a Delaware, who had a town at the mouth of the Hocking River and then later moved amongst the Shawnee. Upper Shawnee Town, near where Point Pleasant is today. Lower Shawnee Town, where Portsmouth is today. A little Pick Town, or Skipakeepee, somewhere just south of Lexington. And then the Overhill Cherokees. All of these people start hunting in this region that now is populated with abundance of furs and skins in that period there. These are some of the traders who were licensed in Pennsylvania to trade with the Ohio Indians. And these are some of the traders that were licensed in Virginia to trade with the Ohio Indians. So you get the impression that this area is not really an uninhabited wilderness, as John Stewart and others mentioned that it was. If your idea of habitation excludes hunting camps, then maybe you could say it's an uninhabited wilderness in 1750, but it's really not. It's occupied by a lot of people hunting for skins. So the 17th century fur trade did lead to the 18th century fur trade in a number of ways. And this is a scene, a reenacted scene, what would be your typical trading condition in late winter. This is a preparation of hides, putting them out of the way of wolves and bears by propping them up on poles, based upon a description by a guy named James Smith, who was captured by French Mohawks in Braddock's defeat. And then this is your typical trade blanket scene where the trader has come in, carried his goods in on horses, on pack horses, throws the blanket out, spreads his goods out, and they barter. And yes, the women are involved. The American Indian women are driving the trade in many ways. This is a product of the period that we've been talking about. Bison in West Virginia. What do I mean by that? Well, you read this quote, and you say, based upon archaeological evidence, and I would add, based upon historical evidence from literature in the region. Arthur, if he mentioned buffalo to Wood, Wood didn't mention it. And Wood would have mentioned it because they were interested in buffalo. Buffalo indicated that you had a region that was growing up from having been farmed, typically. Well, when Arthur's in the Kanawha Valley, it's still occupied by people who are farming it and burning the woods, preparing a place that the buffaloes might want to come into. But remember, he's here in 1673, 74. 17th century. No evidence that they're here in the Kanawha Valley until about 1700. Sometime around 1700 and after. They're coming into the region. Why? Because the Monotones, the Mosopolains, they're gone because of the Iroquois Wars. Well, by 1762, we have buffalo items on the trade list. Buffalo tallow is being traded at Fort Pitt, 1762, just as an example. And look at all these skins. So the skin trade is definitely back. Skin trade's back. And add to it buffalo tallow, because the buffaloes have moved into the region for the first time. Folks, that's all I have tonight. I'll take questions if we have time for questions. Any questions? You may be able to stay awake?
Just a comment, there are no buffalo remains found at any of the sites.
There were no buffalo remains found at any prehistoric sites anywhere in West Virginia. No prehistoric sites at all, which leads, that was one of the reasons why Tankersley and Adams made that conclusion, because there have been no buffalo bones. There was an image of a buffalo found at, I don't remember where. Do you remember? Well, it was a pipe.
Southside and Mason County.
Southside and Mason County.
Yeah.
That's the only known buffalo. You wouldn't call it an artifact. What would you call it? Ecofact, I think they call it. It's an image of a buffalo made on a pipe. And that was from the prehistoric or protohistoric? Protohistoric. So right about the time Gabriel Arthur's coming into the region.
Hey, Doug.
Yes. Well, we had another hand back here first.
What? I'm not aware of what tallow is.
Tallow is fat of an ungulate.
Of a what?
Of an ungulate, buffalo, deer, cow,
Okay.
because it's hard at room temperature, or it's not runny at room temperature,
Okay.
and it makes good axle grease.
Okay.
And that's probably what they were using it for, is for axle grease. It has many other uses as well. Mix it with beeswax, and you can make a pretty good waterproofing agent for leather goods.
Okay.
What's that? You can make candles out of it, right? Tallow candles. Absolutely. You can imagine a buffalo taken in winter has a lot of fat. Nancy.
You were talking about the little images, the crude images
Yeah.
that they.
I'm going to bring them up, yeah.
Is there any connection with that and the Navajo fetish?
I don't know. I don't really know. But I know what you're saying. Little items. It's suspected by the archaeologists that they were fetishes of one sort or another. You know, it might have been like a talisman somebody carried to protect them or something like that. Let me get to that image. Pass it. There we go.
There.
It is possible, some folks have conjectured that they were carrying them around in pouches or something for good luck charms or whatever. It was interesting to me that Swanson didn't say what they were being used for by the modern Youchees. If maybe he did, maybe it wasn't revealed to him. You know, you just never know. Other questions?
Would you put the picture of the woodpeckers back up there, please?
Sure, woodpeckers. Let's do this. And we'll find it. And if there's a question I can answer while I'm finding it, I'll be glad to do that.
There they are.
Okay.
Huh. Wow.
Notice the difference in the length of the bill.
Yeah.
And that's an old specimen of an ivory-billed woodpecker. Living birds had bright white bills. That's why they were called ivory bills. It wouldn't kind of tan like that. bright white. Beautiful implements. And you can imagine if you wanted to make a really beautiful crown for your head, take a whole bunch of those heads with the red and the black and the white in juxtaposition to one another and make a crown out of that, or some kind of beautiful ornament to hang from your neck or whatever. And that's what the American Indians were doing in the 1730s when Catesby mentioned. There was another hand up.
In the Iroquois Wars, what was the Iroquois' intention? Did they want to drive everyone else out of the region? Did they actually want to settle it?
Initially they were attempting to control the fur trade. See, this relationship they had with the British meant that if they could control the Indians that were further west and further south, they could funnel all those furs through them to the British. You know, again, it's that game of the trader tries to get around the middleman to get a better price from somebody who lives further away. And the Iroquois are trying to prevent that just like the Occaneecians are trying to prevent it. The Iroquois are a little better at it, a lot better at it. But eventually, remember this is happening over the course of 70 years, eventually it almost becomes like a heroin addiction. They have lost so many of their own people in these incessant wars. This is based upon a priest commenting to his superior back in France that there are no more pure-blood Iroquois. What does he mean by that? Well, he says, they're incessant wars, they've lost so many people. Now, most of the Iroquois are former prisoners taken by the Iroquois in their wars. So they get to this point where they have to go take prisoners. Not so much controlling the beaver trade anymore, they just have to take prisoners to fulfill the ranks. They have to have enough soldiers in the future and employers in the future to continue to maintain control of the region. So, it's a tough situation to be in.
Every beaver in Pennsylvania and West Virginia today comes from a pair that was imported from Wisconsin.
Did you hear that? Every beaver in Pennsylvania and West Virginia today comes from a pair imported from Wisconsin, which tells you the populations in the Appalachian region went down to nothing. Two reasons. One is there was a lot of trade in beaver skins. No doubt that put a damper on it. But then in the late 1700s up through the 1800s, we had tremendous expansion of agriculture and tremendous cutting of trees all over both those states. That's probably one of the major factors for the demise of the passenger pigeon was the loss of nut-bearing trees. Because in just a few decades, most of the trees from the Appalachian region were taken out. So, thank goodness for Wisconsin, because I like beavers. Yes, Jim?
Doug, you're showing people doing these journeys of hundreds of miles and thousands of miles. And I'm looking at the shoes that you're wearing.
Yeah.
And I can't tell for sure if they've got soles on them or is it...
No, they have holes in them.
Okay.
This is accurate. This is historically accurate boxing here. You know, on any given day, it's going to have a hole in it.
Well, I'm wondering, so did people just, their feet were just toughened up and more muscular and so it wasn't a big deal?
Go to any region in the world where folks still travel barefoot most of the time and they're hardworking out in their fields. Diane and I went to Guatemala and we saw lines of people, miles long, coming into the city after having foraged in the outlands for wood to cook their food with. And I mean, old people, we think they were old, they might not have been old, but they were worn out. And their feet looked like elephants' feet, the bottom of elephants' feet. They were all barefoot. Most of them were barefoot. So it's usage over time, build a huge callus up. Are there foot problems? Yes. Hence the need, another need for buffalo tallow. Hot buffalo tallow rubbed on a raw cut at the bottom of your foot. Works wonders. I know because I've done it. Other questions?
So they use tallow medicinally as well?
Medicinally, yeah. Tallow had a lot of uses. But I always like to say when we're talking about medicinal uses of animals, probably bear's oil. Bear's oil is probably the most diverse animal oil product or animal fat product in the period, at least in the 18th century. We pretty well documented. So many people using bear's grease for so many things. Food, medicine, waterproofing, or making something water resistant. Just all over the place, all over the map. There's a quote from an old white fella in the late 18th century, living in north central West Virginia, would have become north central West Virginia. And he was quoted and written this way: "I drink a pint of bar all every day." Pintbarile. That's how the person wrote it down, to try to give us an idea of the inflection, the dialect. Other questions?
He even said why he did it, remember?
What?
He said why he drank.
Oh yeah, to keep his giants supple.
Probably did.
His GINTS supple. I'm getting to the point where I need some of that. Any other questions? And we have staff that need to go home, so.
It's really interesting to note that how much man has changed a lot of the environment and things.
Over time, the reason we had cane breaks here in the Kanawha Valley, and we had meadows, and we had slashes and savannas, was because of the fire that American Indians and prehistoric Americans were using over time. Greg Springer out of OSU, maybe, I can't remember now, he's a researcher who has worked in West Virginia, and he looked at Rupp's Cave, and he did some geochronology based upon carbon dating and the types of material found. A couple of different methods he used, and determined that people had been burning that landscape around Rupp's Cave for about 4,000 years. Constantly. I mean, it's consistent through time, burning, changing the landscape over time. And that meshes with a lot of work that other archaeologists have done in the southern Appalachians. Fessenmeyers and some others have done that work, and basically they all come down to about the same time frame, about 4,000, 4,500, 3,000 years ago in the region. People are burning the woods and converting them into grasslands. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm glad you had an interest. One book specifically, but that's only because I forgot to mention others. Many of those journals that I'm quoting from are right here in the Archives Library or up in the stacks. And the staff here is always helpful. They've all been really helpful to me whenever I want to do some research. It's tough getting information from the 17th century and specifically be able to apply to West Virginia. But if you're going to be able to do it, it's going to be in part to the folks here who are going to help you find the documents you might want to research to dig this information up. So I'd like to give I think we should give a hand to the staff here. Thank you all for coming out and your interest in this topic. Appreciate it. And come see me at one of my presentations when I convert it to Gabriel Arthur.